Today's lesson is all about bacteria and viruses. Now, because we're combining two chapters, or sections rather, into one, there are a lot of objectives that go along with today's lesson. I'd like you to, as you're listening, be able to think about describing the characteristics of bacteria, explaining how bacteria reproduce, comparing and contrasting eubacteria and archaebacteria. Those should sound familiar from our talk about kingdoms on Monday. Explain how viruses are similar to and different from living things. I'd like you to be able to list the four major groups of virus shapes and to describe the two kinds of viral reproduction. So just a quick review about some of our bacteria from Monday. There are lots and lots of bacteria on Earth. There are actually more types of bacteria on Earth than all other organisms or living things combined. Bacteria belong to either kingdom Eubacteria or kingdom Archaebacteria, and they're considered to be really, really old. They're the oldest forms of life on Earth, some scientists think. All bacteria are going to be single-celled, so instead of having lots of cells that make them up, they're all one cell each, and they're grouped by their shapes. They're distinctly shaped. Bacteria's shape comes from the fact that they have rigid cell walls. Now, the cell walls in bacteria are a little different than the cell walls in plants. For starters, they're made from a totally different substance. The three most common shapes of bacteria that we'll see are bacilli. These are also sometimes called rod-shaped bacteria. And they have a large surface area, which is really great when it comes to taking in nutrients, but it means that they can dry out quickly, so that impacts the environments that they can live in. We also have cocci bacteria, which are spherical, so they're going to look like little globes, little beads. They don't dry out as quickly because they don't have as large of a surface area. Then we have my personal favorite shape, Spirillobacteria. These guys are long and spiral-shaped. They are going to move using an organ called a flagella. This is what a flagella might look like. It's a hair-like part that spins, and as it spins, it works like the motor on a boat, and it allows that bacteria to move around. All bacteria are also prokaryotes. You might remember that word from Monday. It means that the organism doesn't have a nucleus. It's a single cell life form that doesn't have a nucleus. Prokaryotes, animals without a nucleus, or living things without a nucleus, are going to move, and they're going to find ways to get energy just like other animals or living things. They're going to be able to function on their own. They are independent organisms. They don't need other organisms to survive. They are typically simpler. They're not as complex as other eukaryotes, so cells that do have a nucleus, and they reproduce differently as well. Instead of reproducing by breaking into identical cells and sharing genetic information in the nucleus, these guys are going to reproduce through a process called binary fission. This is a form of asexual reproduction, so that means that each cell is going to be a clone or an exact copy of the cells that it comes from. It's pretty simple too. There's the cell with the cell wall. There's a jelly-like substance called a cytoplasm that everything floats around in, and then there's this chromosome. This is the DNA inside of the bacteria cell. It's not located in a nucleus. It's just floating around on its own. The first thing that happens in binary fission is that chromosome is duplicated. So instead of one, we have two. Next, a process called cytokinesis happens, and this is where that cell starts to chop itself in half. And when cytokinesis is done, binary fission is complete, and we have two identical daughter cells. Those cells are clones of one another, so they have the same genetic information, the same characteristics. They're identical in every way. Bacteria sometimes struggle to survive or to get by if the environment is too dry or too cold or even sometimes too hot. And so they have this really unique ability to form endospores. An endospore is a thick-walled protective coat that bacteria can form around themselves, sort of like a chrysalis that a caterpillar might form, but this has like almost superpowers, I would call it. The endospore can protect and provide for bacteria for a really, really, really long time. Scientists think that these endospores can preserve bacteria even up through millions of years. And so the bacteria basically becomes dormant. It doesn't do anything. It just hunkers down and waits in its endospore when the conditions get to be too rough. When the conditions improve, the endospore breaks open and the virus, or the bacteria, becomes active again. Remember, there were those two kingdoms of bacteria. Eubacteria, or true bacteria, are the most common. There are more eubacteria organisms than organisms in all the rest of the kingdoms combined. And scientists believe that they're really, really old. Remember that kingdom Archaebacteria are full of extreme loving bacteria, extreme loving organisms. They're broken into three categories. There are heat lovers, and these guys don't just like a little bit of heat, they like a lot of heat. They live on ocean vents and hot springs, and they can withstand temperatures of more than 250 degrees Celsius. Keep in mind that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, so we're talking about a temperature that's really, really hot. The next category of Archaebacteria are salt lovers. These guys live in salty water like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea. And then there are methane-making Archaebacteria. These guys give off a methane gas, which is sort of a really smelly, toxic gas. They live in swamps, and they live inside animal intestines too. Talk about extreme environments. Those are our bacteria. Now let's talk about viruses. Viruses might seem similar to bacteria in some ways. For instance, they're really, really small, and they all function independently of one another, just like a bacteria would. Just like bacteria, viruses can make you sick, and so sometimes people get them mixed up. But a virus is a microscopic particle. Notice it's not an organism, it's not a living thing, it's a particle that gets inside a cell and oftentimes is going to destroy that cell that it gets into. Viruses can cause all sorts of diseases, everything from the common cold to the flu to warts and AIDS. Now, AIDS is a disease that you maybe have heard a little bit more about because Dr. Fauci, who is in charge of a lot of the coronavirus decision-making and policies in the United States, used to be in charge of trying to find a way to better understand and stop the spread of a disease called AIDS. Viruses are tiny. They're smaller even than the smallest bacteria. And even though they're not alive, they're rapidly changing. Because they're so small and because they can change or adapt to different situations rapidly, scientists are not quite sure how many different types of viruses actually exist. So like living things, viruses have proteins, which are like chemicals that make them up, and they have genetic material. So they have coding to them that help them to determine what they're supposed to do. However, unlike a living thing, viruses aren't able to take in energy. They don't eat. They don't grow. They stay really small, and they don't really become more complex than when they started. They don't use oxygen. They don't have to break down food because, again, they don't eat, and they can't function on their own. So that is a huge difference between a bacteria and a virus. A bacteria can live in a really extreme environment or even in the dirt outside your house on its own for a really long time and be totally fine. A virus, if it's separated from its host, is not going to be able to survive. Or it's not going to be able to continue to do what it's been programmed to do, would be a better way to say that. Remember that a host is an organism that a parasite lives inside of, that a parasite takes food and shelter from. So a virus is similar to a parasite because it uses a host cell like a factory. It forces that cell to make new viruses as opposed to making new and healthy cells. Viruses are also going to be grouped by shape, sort of like bacteria. We have four main shapes that you see here. This is the crystal shape. The poliovirus is a crystal-shaped virus. We have viruses that look like spheres. Influenza is going to fit into this category along with HIV and AIDS. We have cylinder-shaped viruses like the tobacco mosaic virus, which affects plants. And then this is my personal favorite shape, I guess, the spacecraft shape. This is a group of viruses that attack only other bacteria. They kind of look like spacecraft. In addition to being grouped by shape, some viruses are also grouped by life cycles. They're also, if we understand them well enough, sometimes grouped by the type of genetic material that is inside of them, so the type of directions that they have. Every virus is made of a protein coat. So you and I wear coats to protect against cold in the winter. Viruses have coats that protect them inside the conditions of their host. This protein coat is really there to protect the coding, the genetic material that tells the virus what to do once it gets into a host cell. Many viruses have this a special protein coat that matches their specific host. So think of it sort of like you're trying to get into a military base. If you go in wearing your bright pink winter coat with a fur hood, do you think that those military generals are going to just let you in? No, you're going to majorly stand out, right? You need the right kind of jacket. You need the right kind of hat and look in order to get into that military base. Viruses have protein coats that allow them to blend in and to enter very specific hosts. Genetic material inside of these viruses is going to be made up of either DNA or RNA. So RNA is one strand of genetic material. DNA, like what you and I have, is actually two strands of genetic material. Both of them contain information for making new proteins. So viruses are sometimes going to have DNA and sometimes going to have RNA inside of them. Warts and chickenpox are caused by viruses that have DNA inside of them. Viruses like AIDS and the flu and colds and coronavirus are actually going to have RNA as the genetic material that makes them up. A virus's number one job, its coding, what it's designed to do is make more of itself. Viruses attack living things and, like we said earlier, turn them into factories. They turn them into ways to make more of themselves. The cycle that viruses use to make more of themselves is called the lytic cycle. So it starts with the virus attaching to the host cell. It has that protein coat that allows it to get in. And then once it's in, it replicates. It creates more of its genetic material. Then it assembles that genetic material with a new protein coat. And unfortunately, it usually kills the cell when all those new viruses get out. Some viruses are going to go straight into that lytic cycle and start making new viruses. Others are going to wait for a while. They have a second cycle, a dormant cycle, called the lysogenic cycle. They enter the host, and their genetic material is going to be copied and shared, but that's as far as it goes. It's going to allow the virus is going to allow that cell to reproduce, carrying its genetic material with it for a while until it decides to become active. And that's when it starts assembling and killing off all those cells. So the lytic cycle is when the virus is taken over, making more of itself and killing the cells. The lysogenic cycle is when the virus is sort of putting itself into the cell and biding its time as that cell begins to duplicate and reproduce on its own. Unlike a bacteria, viruses are not quite as easy to kill. With bacterial infections, we can use antibiotics to kill off those living things inside of our body. Viruses don't respond to antibiotics. Sometimes we can take an antiviral medication that stops the virus from reproducing. But remember, because viruses change really fast, these antiviral medications aren't going to work for very long before the virus catches on and changes the way it's doing things. So for that reason, most viruses are not easily cured with a medicine. There are lots of different steps, though, that we can take to avoid getting viruses, as you know. Vaccines are a really important way to help of the body's immune system to get ready to fight if a virus infects the system. Having a really strong immune system is the best way to keep from getting really sick with a virus. Also, washing your hands, not touching your face, your eyes, and your nose, not avoiding contact with wild animals that might carry viruses that your body's not used to fighting. Those are some strategies that we see a lot in the news, and really they are the best ways to avoid getting or contracting a virus. If you do get a virus, the best thing you can do while you're sick is allow your body the chance to catch up and to heal and to have enough energy to fight and to put all its resources into the immune system. So it's important to rest and drink lots and lots of fluids. Having lots of fluids helps your body actually to fight and to stay healthier during that process. So for Friday, what I would like you to do is to continue thinking about viruses and bacteria, how they're similar and how they're different. I'd like you to create a poster. You can do that using a piece of paper and take a picture of it at home, or you can create that poster on the computer. I'd also like you to come up with at least one question that you have about viruses or bacteria. If you have questions specifically about the coronavirus, feel free to post those as well. There's a spot for you to put in your question, and there's a spot for you to submit your poster on my website for today. On Friday, we're going to do things a little bit differently. Normally, our Google Hangout from 10:30 to 11:30 is optional. On Friday, I would like everybody to attend because we're going to have a special The Doctor is in Hangout session where I'm going to, hopefully, if everything works out, bring in an actual doctor, a physician, to our Hangout to answer questions that you've submitted and to answer other questions you might have that come up as a part of the conversation. So on Friday, we're going to have a required Hangout during our normal Google Hangout time. We're going to have a chance for you to ask additional questions, but please submit those other questions beforehand. And then in addition to that, you'll have a chance to turn in your posters.